Monster, new film out on Netflix, not to be confused with the 2003 film under the same title with which starred Charlize Theron. This one was shot all the way back in 2017, premiered at the 2018 Sundance Festival, and then went nowhere. Finally, Netflix acquired the distribution rights, and the movie is widely available starting this weekend. It's a courthouse drama that centers the character of Steve Harmon, a 17-year-old boy from Harlem. He's a smart student, interested in film. He shoots a lot of his own stuff for a film club at his prestigious high school, comes from a good family. At the beginning of the film, he is arrested and accused of taking part in a robbery that ended up with a store clerk being murdered, being shot dead. Harmon is accused of being the lookout for the actual perpetrators, but as such, he is also labeled a criminal and put before court. And initially, we get the sense that he must surely be completely innocent, but then we learn that at least he knew the robbers and he hung out with them on some days sometimes. And we learn more and more about the actual events that led to his imprisonment. So the film really has two intertwining parts, both shot with completely different styles. One is the current day courthouse drama, which is very washed out grays and blues, very dry and cold, almost clinical scenes, anxiety inducing arguments between the lawyers, the impassioned looks from the jury. You can feel the suffocating atmosphere of the courthouse as well as the prison. On the other hand, we have the flashbacks from Steve's life before the accusation and the events that led to it. That takes place in Harlem, and it looks like a completely different movie. Vibrant colors, sun rays shining through every frame, warm oranges and reds, the atmosphere of a hot summer afternoon in New York, the colorful clothes, happy people hanging out, Steve's time in the film club and the girls she meets, and some of the photographs and short films that he makes. It's definitely meant to show how amazing his life was before and how the accusation cuts that off completely, how it removes him from that safe and enjoyable lifestyle and takes away all the color with it. So it's definitely a movie that is very aware of how to use its cinematography to kind of tell the story. The story itself, which is also quite good, and I know that based on the description that I gave, it sounds very typical. Black kid faces injustice from the court because of racial profiling. I thought so as well, but then the longer the movie goes on, the more it reveals that challenges those assumptions. The story is actually more complicated and more gray, morally speaking, to the point that as it ends, even though the jury of the court does reach a verdict, I definitely felt that the moral judgment is still reserved for the audience. We're supposed to look at Steve ourselves and decide, was he guilty or innocent? Is it even so simple to draw one single line which puts him as either a regular citizen or an irredeemable criminal? Maybe that line is blurred and he is somewhat at fault, but to what extent? What punishment does that deserve? It's all deliberately left very open, which I certainly enjoyed. The one major element of the film that didn't work for me was the voiceover narration. The movie is framed as being shot by Steve. He says, "This is the story of my life, written and directed by me," and so on. So he's telling his own story and he narrates most of the scenes. Now, I believe that voiceovers are a tricky cinematic tool because they are kind of a crutch for the writers. You can use it to tell the audience stuff that you then don't have to show through the scene. And more often than not, it feels cheap and lazy. And sometimes it doesn't, but unfortunately, this was one of the former cases for me. I thought that the narration didn't bring enough itself to offset that feeling that the filmmakers, were kind of lazy. And on the other hand, I kind of get why that was a creative choice that they made. It kind of fits the story of Steve being a filmmaker and so on. So I can understand the thought process behind it, but I still think it would have been better to work around it. Final point, I enjoyed a couple of the supporting performances from the film. It has small appearances from Jeffrey Wright, John David Washington, and Tim Blake Nelson, all of whom create a great presence in the film, each of them on their own. And also, crucially, they all have that certain gravitas, a certain adult air about them, which again contrasts with Steve being just a teenager, puts him even more out of his depth. So overall, I thought it was surprisingly good. On paper, it looks very derivative and unoriginal, but the execution certainly elevates it. It's definitely not perfect for me, and it has its flaws, but overall, I think between the good story with a solid moral dilemma and great cinematography, it is a pretty solid watch.